Good afternoon and welcome to our second lesson on carbohydrate structure. This is our lesson outline for this video. Let's first define some terms. When we use the word monomer, we are referring to the simplest form of the building block of a polymer. So, if we extend that definition and use the word polymer, we are referring to the unique combination of monomers of varying length. So, to make it simple, ang polymer ay combination ng monomers at ang monomers, ito yung simplest form that we use to combine to form polymers. So, naglalaro lang doon yung definition. We also use the term macromolecules to refer to polymers that are derived from basic chemical groups that combine to form cellular structures. So, in biochemistry, we have 4 major macromolecules na siya din ginagamit natin to approach biochemistry. So, what are these 4 major macromolecules? We have carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So, ang carbohydrate, protein, lipids, and nucleic acids, they combine with each other in particular proportions to make the organelles and subcellular structures, such as the cell membrane and the nucleus. Let's take a quick look at what carbohydrates are. So carbohydrates are easy to define because nandun na sa pangalan niya ang kanyang properties. Carbohydrates are hydrated carbon. So please take a quick look at the image in the left. You will understand from this structure that glucose has 6 carbons, and for each carbon, let's say carbon number 3, attached to it is a molecule of water. So at carbon number 3, for example, at the top of this image, at the left-hand side, you have hydroxyl, and at the right-hand side, you have hydrogen. Hydroxyl plus hydrogen is water, and therefore carbohydrates are hydrates of carbon. Another property that we can look at in this image is that carbohydrates are polyhydroxylated. Again, take a quick look at glucose. You have 6 carbons of glucose, and for the majority of carbons here, carbons number 2 to 6, you will see attachments of hydroxyl group. In particular, you have 5 hydroxyl groups attached to the 5 carbons in glucose. So glucose and all the other carbohydrates are polyhydroxylated. We also have norms in describing carbohydrates. So carbon number 1 is usually the major functional group. So how do we number the carbohydrates? Much like we number the different functional groups in organic chemistry. So carbon number 1 is designated based on the presence of the major functional group. So again, take a quick look at the image in the left and the topmost portion. You will see here the molecule of glucose, which is projected in the Fischer projection or fishbone projection. Carbon number 1 is different from all the rest because at carbon number 1, highlighted in pink, you will see the aldehyde functional group, whereas all the other carbons only have an alcoholic functional group. Therefore, carbon number 1 contains the aldehyde group. You will also see in this image that glucose can be represented in many ways. So makikita nyo that at the topmost portion of the image, parang fish bone yung projection ng glucose. And that is the Fisher projection. So madali siyang intindihin at alalahanin dahil Fisher equates to fish bone, parang buto ng isda after you consume the viand. Okay? But direct your attention now on the image at the bottom. You see here that it's still glucose yung nasa gitna. It's the same molecule, but it is projected in a different way. And this projection, the ring projection, is what we call the Hawthorne projection. Okay? So fishbone, Fisher, ring projection, Hawthorne projection. Carbon number 1 and carbon number 5 will fuse to form a hemiacetal. Okay? So a hemiacetal, if you will remember your organic chemistry, is the combination of an aldehyde with an alcohol. So take a quick look at the Hawthorne projection here in the middle and in the bottom of the image. You will see that the alcohol group of carbon number 5 combines with carbon number 1, which contains the aldehyde. Okay? So the aldehyde, carbon number 1 with double bond oxygen or carbonyl carbon, combines with the alcohol of carbon number 5 to form a hemiacetal. Okay? And that is in the form of the glucopyranose structure, which we will discuss later. Another norm is if a sugar or any structure differs from all other isomers only in carbon number 1, that is called an anomer. So, simply put, yung anomer is an isomer na nagdi-differ lang in carbon number 1. Okay? Next, let's touch on chirality. So, we need to understand chirality kasi makikita natin siya sa sobrang daming macromolecules in biochemistry. So, carbohydrates are not an exception. They are usually chiral. So, pag sinabi natin chiral, each functional group attached to the central carbon is different. So let's take a quick look here at glyceraldehyde. In reviewing, carbon has a valence of 4. Ibig sabihin nun, meron siyang 4 na free electrons that can form bonds with other structures. Okay? So, here, carbon has a valence of 4 and therefore, it can form bonds with 4 other molecules or structures or functional groups. So, dito sa image, this is the structure of glyceraldehyde. Glyceraldehyde is a 3-carbon sugar. Sa gitna ng image na to, you will find the central carbon, to which attached are aldehyde, yung yellow, alcohol, yung pink, ethanol, yung methanol, yung blue, and hydrogen, the unshaded structure. So here, the central carbon observes chirality because each bond that is formed from the valence is different. Next, let's touch on the ring configuration. So, sinabi natin kanina that sugars can either be projected through the Fisher projection or the Hawthorne projection. When the Hawthorne projection is used and a hemiacetal is formed, yung diniscuss natin kanina, structures can either be in the form of pyran or furan. So dapat ma-differentiate nyo kung ano yung pyran and furan. Pyran is a 6-membered ring structure which includes oxygen. And furan is 5-membered. So, let's take a quick look at this image on the right. At the left-hand portion of this image, you have beta-D-glucopyranose. So dito, glucose is represented as a form of pyran. So let's count. Oxygen, first member, and then going clockwise, you have carbon, 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 and carbon. So you have here a pyran, 6-membered ring. On the right side of the image, you have fructose, which is another sugar or another monosaccharide. But even if it has 6 carbons in total and 6 carbons in the Fischer projection, fructose is represented here as furan, which means it is only 5-membered. From oxygen, that's member 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay? The other 2 carbons are represented as side chains. So a pyran, again, is 6-membered, and a furan is 5-membered, including the oxygen. Next, let's discuss a little bit on the naming of monosaccharides. So we can either name sugars or monosaccharides in terms of their length. We have 3 carbons, triose, 4 carbons, tetrose, 5 carbons, pentose, and 6 carbons, hexose. Okay? So depende sa dami ng carbons. But we can also name monosaccharides based on the prevailing functional group. So if the prevailing functional group is aldehyde, we use the term aldose. And if the prevailing functional group is ketone, we use the term ketose. So, what is the key here? Pag nakita niyong OSE, OS, it refers to a sugar. Triose, 3 carbons, aldose, aldehyde, ketose, ketone containing. So let's just go through this table of the commonly encountered sugars in metabolism. So triose, 3 carbons, ang aldose niyan would be glyceraldehyde, and the ketose would be dihydroxyacetone. Glyceraldehyde and dihydroxyacetone you will encounter a lot in glycolysis. 4 carbons, tetrose, the aldose form is erythrose, and the ketose form is erythrulose. We'll find these tetroses in the pentose phosphate pathway. 5 carbons, ribose, and that's the aldose form. Ketose form would be ribulose. 6 carbons, which we commonly encounter. Ang aldose dito is glucose. Ketose, for 6 carbons would be fructose. So dito pa lang, maiintindihan niyo na that glucose is an aldehyde-containing sugar and fructose is a ketone-containing sugar. So, let's move on. We have here the 3 major physiologic monosaccharides. Ito yung common na sugars na ma-encounter natin sa katawan. Glucose is the primary fuel for energy metabolism in most tissues. And we have discussed glucose a while ago. It's an aldehyde, and the aldehyde is found in carbon number 1. Galactose, however, is similar to glucose, but it differs only in carbon number 4. That's why galactose is a C4 epimer of glucose. In the body, galactose is conjugated or attached to lipids to form the different lipid-based structures in the body. such as the lipids in the brain and the lipids forming the myelin sheath. Okay? It's also conjugated or attached to proteins for antigenic properties. So, for example, the immune system determines what is alien and what is host based on the presence of galactose residues. And that is particularly important in red blood cells. Okay? So that's why you just can't give the red blood cells of one person to another without checking the antigenicity of the red blood cells, which are dependent on galactose. Fructose, again, kung makikita nyo dito, at carbon number 2, you will find the ketone functional group. That's why fructose is a ketose. It's the functional isomer of glucose, again, because glucose is an aldehyde, and a different functional group, fructose. So it's the functional isomer of glucose. Fructose is the primary energy source of sperm so that they can move, and fructose is a stimulator of lipogenesis, so that if you have the same number of calories taken in by the person, but one person takes in more fructose, even if you have the same number of calories taken in, because of the presence of fructose, that person will make a lot of fat because it is a stimulator of lipogenesis. Next, let's discuss disaccharides. So disaccharides are monosaccharides that undergo condensation to form disaccharides. And what is the particular form of condensation? It's a dehydration condensation. So, the usual participant carbons in the bond are carbon number 1 and carbon number 4. And the bond that is formed is called a glucosidic bond, which is in essence an ether. Okay? So, isa-isahin natin to, no? At the topmost of the image, you will see carbon number 1. Okay? On the left side, and carbon number 4 on the right side. Okay? So, you will understand here that it formed a hemiacetal already. That's why you have the ring structure. So, the hemiacetal of carbon number 1 combines with the alcohol of carbon number 4, and water is removed. Okay? So, tingnan niyo yung pink. Mawawala yung water. Hydroxyl in one sugar and hydrogen in another sugar that will go out as water. And by removing water, you form an ether, which is ROR. And the R's are the individual sugars. Okay? So here you have glucose combining with glucose to form maltose. Glucose, carbon number 1, you remove the hydroxyl there and combine it with the oxygen of sugar number 2 at carbon number 4. You remove the hydrogen and connect the two using a central oxygen. So hydroxyl plus hydrogen, that's H2O. You remove that and you form maltose. Next, we have discussed how maltose was formed in the previous slide. And maltose is, in essence, a breakdown product of the starch that we have taken in through food. Maltose is broken down into individual glucose units before it is absorbed. So, let's now discuss other common disaccharides. lactose is found in milk and is a substantial energy source for infants. And that is special kasi yung infants, yung genes nila are active in expressing and synthesizing lactase, which is the enzyme that is found in the small intestines to digest lactose. But as the human grows up, the human becomes an adolescent and an adult, the expression of lactase decreases. So that tayong mga adults, we have a difficult time digesting lactose. And that is especially true for Asians. Okay? So that's why a lot of Asians are lactose intolerant, or they have what we call lactase deficiency. So look at the image in the right, at the top portion, that's the structure of lactose. So lactose is formed by the combination of galactose and glucose. So the structure on the left of the ether, that's R1, is galactose. So you need to take a quick look at carbon number 4. You will understand that at carbon number 4, the orientation of hydroxyl and hydrogen is switched. Sucrose, on the other hand, is synthesized by a few plants, such as the maple tree. That's why you use it for maple syrup. You have beets, they make sucrose, and tubo. No? So the sucrose is primarily employed as a sweetener. In the body, it has a minor physiologic role, but only for the stimulation of lipogenesis. Again, because sucrose is made up of fructose. So if you take a quick look at the image here in the bottom, you will see that sucrose is made up of sugar number 1, glucose, and sugar number 2, fructose. And you will also appreciate here that glucose is in the form of a pyranose and fructose is in the form of a furan. And again, the combination is an ether linkage. Polysaccharides, on the other hand, are made up of linked monosaccharides. So kanina, nung nag-discuss tayo ng polymers, yung polymer ng sugars would be polysaccharides. And the monomers of polysaccharides would be monosaccharides. So the configuration is usually 1 to 4. So carbon number 1 of one sugar connected to carbon number 4 of the next sugar to make linear configuration, and 1 to 6 carbon number 1 of one sugar and carbon number 6 of the next sugar to form a branching connection. Physiologically important polysaccharides include glycogen, which is a form of energy reserve in muscles and the liver, cellulose, which is found in plant cell walls, chitin is found in the exoskeleton of insects and the cell walls of fungi, and peptidoglycan, which is found in the cell wall of bacteria, which is an immunogen, which makes it a stimulator of immune response. So if we take a quick look again at the image here in the right, you will understand that there are two forms of polysaccharides. Homopolysaccharides are made up of only one type of monosaccharide, and that includes, for example, cellulose, which is only made up of glucose, starch, which is only made up of glucose, and glycogen, which is only made up of glucose. It can be unbranched in the form of amylose, which is a component of starch, or it can be branched. For example, in amylopectin, which is another component of starch, or in glycogen. Heteropolysaccharides, on the other hand, are made up of, by its name, more than one type of monosaccharide. So you can have two monomer types and unbranched. For example, in peptidoglycan, where there are alternating units of N-acetyl glucosamine and N-acetyl muraminic acid, and you can have multiple monomer types, as is found in more complex cell walls, such as in the cell wall of TB tubercle, the tubercle bacillus, and in the cell wall of gram-negative bacteria. And lastly, I just like to emphasize how polysaccharides combine, how monosaccharides combine with each other to form polysaccharides. In the image here in the top, you have here a strand of amylose, which is the linear component of starch. As you will observe, the link, the ether linkage, is formed between carbon number 1 of a sugar and carbon number 4 of the next sugar. And because carbon number 1 and carbon number 4 are found in the same plane, it will make up a linear stranding of the polysaccharide here, which is starch. So the component monosaccharides that you will find here in amylose are glucose. Okay. If you look at the image in the bottom, this is how branching occurs. At the bottom portion of the image, you will see the main chain, carbon number 1 and carbon number 4, carbon number 5, and carbon number 6 of one sugar, and attached to it is an ether linkage that connects to carbon number 1 of the first sugar of the branch. Okay, so that's how branching occurs. And because carbon number 6 of the first sugar from the main chain is already in a different plane, by forming an ether bond with carbon number 1 of the next sugar, the orientation shifts, and there is already formation of a branch which is found in a different plane. And that's how branching occurs in polysaccharides. So, through this lesson, we have discussed the basics of monosaccharides, their structures, how to name a monosaccharide based on its number, based on the functional group that is present. We have even understood the basic structure of a sugar, of a carbohydrate, that it is a hydrate of carbon because oriented to the carbon atom is a molecule of sugar. There is a polyhydroxy structure in a carbohydrate. We have even touched on the important carbohydrates in the body: glucose, galactose, and fructose, the important monosaccharides; maltose, lactose, and sucrose, the important disaccharides; starch, cellulose, and glycogen, the important polysaccharides. So, two monosaccharides will combine to form a disaccharide by removing water and forming an ether bond, usually 1,4 connection. Polysaccharides can either be linear through 1,4 connection or branched because there is already orientation into a different plane by forming an ether bond of carbon number 1 and carbon number 6. So, and that's it for our lesson on the physiologically important carbohydrates. So our next lesson will already tackle how the body processes these carbohydrates through metabolism. Thank you for listening.